Well, first I want to thank all of you guys for coming out tonight. I want to thank Father Bardis and the fine folks here at the brewery for putting this event on. And I want to thank my brother Knights of Columbus who are here tonight helping out with everything. I really appreciate that. So before I get started into the meat of this talk, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. As Father said, I do teach political science. Specifically, I teach political theory. That's what I majored in. I focused on the study of Western political thought, and very specifically on Marxism, because in college I was both an atheist and a Marxist. Now, if there are any atheists or agnostics in the audience tonight, I was once one of you, and I've done my best here to try to represent atheism fairly. If I have butchered your beliefs in any way, feel free to raise it during the Q&A, because I want everything to get a fair hearing. I have to kind of say at the outset that deciding what I wanted to talk about tonight, it wasn't too easy. There's so many things one can bring up when talking about atheism. It's a very broad topic. You can look at the classical philosophical arguments for or against the existence of God. You can look at the latest scientific discoveries that some people believe suggest that there is a God, or at least a spiritual reality. One can focus exclusively on morality. Can there be right and wrong if there's no God? So I'm going to touch upon all of those things tonight. But as I was reading the New Atheist literature recently, and I was thinking about my own conversion experience, which I'll kind of weave into what I'm going to say tonight, one thing really stood out to me, and it's the problem that all of the atheists, and especially the new atheists, seem to have with freedom. Okay, so when we use the word freedom, we can mean different things. I think that atheism, at least the way that it's argued for in the Western world, has no way of accounting for freedom. I won't say that it's the only point on which you can challenge atheism. There are many, but freedom really stood out to me. So I'm going to talk about freedom in two different senses tonight. And I think you're going to see that they're closely related, even if they're not exactly the same. So the first sense of the word freedom means the freedom to choose. The freedom that we possess to do one thing instead of another. We typically call this free will. The atheist worldview rests upon certain ideas about reality that make free will impossible. The second sense of the word freedom is political. So for instance, in America, we have freedom of speech. We have the freedom to say what we like within some very broad limits, without fear of government censorship. My background is in political philosophy, so I have primarily looked at freedom as a political idea. Many atheist political philosophers have a real problem with this kind of political freedom as well. And I think it's fair to say the kind of freedom that most of us here probably value. Now, I want to be clear about what I'm not saying as well. I'm not saying that there are no atheists who believe in free will. Some of them do, even though I don't really think that makes any sense for reasons that I'll explain. There are atheists who believe in free will. And I'm not saying that there are no atheists who believe in political liberty. Certainly many of them do. The new atheists in particular are very attached to freedom of speech. Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, when he was alive, they all got in trouble for saying things about Islam that were politically incorrect. And when they were attacked for those things, they vigorously defended and asserted their right to free speech. So when I'm done talking about freedom, I think you'll see with me that they don't really have a sound intellectual basis for proclaiming that freedom, even though it's clearly something that they want. So what I am saying about atheists is that if one takes their basic assumptions and you apply them to human behavior and human societies, there isn't any room left for freedom. I can tell you, as Sam Harris, he likes to go after Islam because he believes that terrorism is consistent with Islamic doctrines. Well, I can tell you as a former communist that, communism is consistent with atheist doctrines, much in the same way he would argue that terrorism and Sharia law and all these things are consistent with Islam. There's a reason. I'm not saying that every communist has to be an atheist, and I'm not saying that every atheist has to be a communist, but there are reasons why so many of the most militant communists throughout history have also been militant atheists. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. There's a reason why the two kind of go together, even if you don't have to be both. I want to start by talking first about the first sense of the word freedom, the freedom that you and I have to choose. Okay, this is something that we all kind of take for granted. We know that sometimes we make choices under difficult circumstances. Sometimes we say to ourselves, I felt like I had no choice. But really, of course, we mean we had a very difficult choice to make. We all experience freedom every moment of every day. Just like you experience breathing oxygen or looking at things made visible to your eyes by light, or not floating off the surface of the earth because of gravity. And as I talk more about this, I think you'll see that we can't escape from freedom in how we talk about the world. And if we tried, the world would become far more absurd than what atheists think Christians believe about the world. Freedom is what we assume in ourselves and in others. We're happy when somebody does a nice thing for us because they meant it. They chose to do it. We're angry when somebody does wrong to us because they chose to do it. They meant it. Some people fly off the handle at pets or inanimate objects too. But we all know the difference between something a person chose to do and something that they did unintentionally. When the initial joy or anger wears off, what sustains those emotions of joy or anger is our sense of how intentional the trigger for those emotions were. And that's why, let's say when a person commits murder, we have different charges that we bring against them. A person can be charged with manslaughter. The exact legal definition of manslaughter is the crime of killing a human being without malice aforethought. Without malice aforethought means without any bad intentions in your mind, that it happened by some accident or some negligence, but not because a person wanted it to happen. But then we have second-degree murder. This is what we call the crime of passion. You intended to kill someone, but you didn't plan it out. It was the heat of the moment. You're still responsible for what you do in the heat of the moment because you're still free. But we recognize that a certain crime like this, as awful as it still isn't as bad as first-degree murder. First-degree murder is when you both intend to kill someone and you also planned it out in advance. You had sufficient time to reflect upon what you were going to do, and at any point along the way, you could have chose to do otherwise, but you didn't. Now, I realize that this doesn't sound very controversial. It all seems fairly obvious. And yet, there are people who deny the existence of free will. And among them are the new atheists. But the crazy thing here is that they can't get away from examples like the ones I just gave you. No matter how much the new atheists twist and turn, they always end up back in the camp of free will. But why do they even try to deny free will, you might be asking? Well, the simple and short version of why new atheists reject free will is that they're materialists. Now, by materialism, I don't mean a personal desire for more wealth or riches or material things. That's one sense of the word. That's not really what I'm driving at here. Now, what I mean by the word materialism is instead the notion that the only thing that exists is matter. Matter, physical stuff, like this table here, the chair that you're sitting on. That's all that exists. But here's the thing. Matter is not free. Okay? If matter is all that there is, then nothing is free. Matter obeys laws. It has to obey laws. Let me give you an example. If I have a crank attached to a gear, and I turn that crank, the gear must turn. It can't do otherwise. It can't choose not to turn. Take a storm, a hurricane, something like that. If the weather conditions are just right, if the temperature of the water, the air pressure, and all those things come together, the storm has to come about. It can't choose not to. And materialists look at the human brain much in the same way. If all of the chemicals in your brain and all of the neurons in your brain are firing a certain way, then it's going to cause you to act out in a certain way, and you can't do otherwise. You have to do it. It's just like the crank and the gear. That's basically what they reduce the person to, and I will show some quotes from that in a bit. So your behavior is not free. So for something to be free, it has to have a non-material part of it that's not bound to obey laws. It can choose to break laws. Now, breaking the law is often a very dangerous thing. We're free to jump off a cliff, but that doesn't mean that we have the power to fly. We're free to shoot up heroin, but that doesn't mean we have the power to enjoy it without becoming addicted to it. So many people confuse freedom with power, and they think that not having the power to do something means you don't have the freedom to do something. But you can be limited in your power and still have freedom. Now, atheists in the Western world sure. Nope, yeah, I wanted to, trust me. Okay, so atheists in the Western world, they're materialists. Because they don't want to leave any room open for a thing like the spirit or the soul. And when they say there's no such thing as a spirit or a soul, because these things can't be verified or proven or measured, they're being highly disingenuous. And this is because they cannot escape freedom, nor can they explain freedom. They try to dismiss it because they know if freedom is a real thing, that it has nothing to do with matter, and that makes materialism false. But they fail to dismiss free will, and they're not honest about failing it. And I'm going to give you an example of this now. Okay, so one of the most prominent new atheists is Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a neuroscientist, which means he studies the brain and how it relates to our behavior. And yet he decided to write a book about morality, which by its very nature implies that human beings have the freedom to choose. And so none of the criticisms of this book that he wrote, The Moral Landscape, really honed in on what I thought it was its greatest weakness. Sam Harris wants to prove that morality can be found in nature. He rejects the idea that, we call it moral relativism. You have your own morality, I have my own morality, everybody has their own morality, it's all relative, no one morality is better than the other. Sam Harris is opposed to that idea, he doesn't agree with that. He thinks that science can discover right and wrong in nature, just the same way that science can tell us what's good for our bodies or what's bad for our bodies, eat this, don't eat that, take this medicine, don't take that. He thinks that science can find answers to moral questions like right and wrong. But he's also a materialist, and he also rejects free will, and so this is a big problem. And he knows it's a big problem, because just knowing what right and wrong is doesn't really matter. You have to have the ability to choose between right and wrong. Now, I'll use his words to describe the problem. Okay, this is what he says. He says, human goodness and human evil are the products of natural events. The great worry is that any honest discussion of the underlying causes of human behavior seem to erode the notion of moral responsibility. If we view people as neuronal weather patterns, how can we coherently speak about morality? So let me rephrase that question for you if you're wondering what a neuronal weather pattern is. If we view people as predetermined in the same way that we view a hurricane as predetermined, it can't change its path, how can we coherently speak about morality? Harris basically views the human mind and human behavior as if it were a storm. The storms don't make choices. Storms are purely the product of natural events. So if all the conditions, again, are present for a storm to appear, it has to appear. It can't choose not to. And that's why we would never speak of trying to hold Hurricane Harvey responsible for putting Houston underwater. It just would be stupid and nonsensical. So, hence his question, which I want to repeat one more time. If we view people as weather patterns, how can we speak about morality? Well, in attempting to answer this question, Harris cannot escape the language of free will. Little by little, he wanders back into the camp of free will without really realizing how he got there. There's really something to behold. He has to eventually admit that we all hold each other more accountable for actions that we consciously planned. Remember my example from before, the difference between first-degree and second-degree murder. We think that first-degree murder is way worse than second-degree murder because first-degree murder is consciously planned. You planned it out, you thought about it. Second-degree murder in the heat of the moment. So Harris admits, and he doesn't contest this, he doesn't deny it, he doesn't argue against it, that yes, we hold people more accountable for things that they are consciously planning. So he acknowledged consciousness, but what does that mean? Why does it matter? So Harris tells us that consciousness is the context in which our intentions become completely available to us. But what does he mean by available to us? If we aren't free to choose, then what is available to us is completely irrelevant. What does it mean if a thing is available? It means that you can use it or not use it. You can act on your intention or not act on it. Well, it turns out that after page in which free will is dismissed as an illusion, with no scientific support whatsoever, Harris tells us that we do have a thing he calls mental freedom. Okay, it's not free will, but mental freedom. He says we can choose to focus on certain facts to the exclusion of others, to emphasize the good rather than the bad, etc. And such choices have consequences for how we view the world. But then he adds in parentheses, and this is really the interesting part, obviously, when I speak about freedom and choices of this sort, I am not endorsing a metaphysical notion of free will. Well, he declares that it's obvious that he isn't endorsing free will, but he never explains what he is endorsing. We don't get a detailed description of this thing he calls mental freedom. It's just a philosophical hit and run. Now, try as he might, and try as they all might, there's no escaping the basic idea that we have some kind of freedom to choose. And Harris was right to worry about discussing the underlying causes of human behavior, because such discussions without fail always lead us right back to free will. Whether you call it mental freedom or free will, or you endorse it in a metaphysical sense or any other sense. Okay, those are just word games. It's freedom or it's not freedom. So Harris eventually does answer his own question. Remember, he asked, if we view people as weather patterns, as things that don't make choices, how can we coherently speak about morality? The answer is we can't. The answer is that when we speak about morality, we have to start using words like freedom and choices again. And so this is the main point I want to make here. When you talk about free choices, you're not talking about matter anymore. You're not talking about physical stuff. You're talking about a substance that we usually call spirit. Spirit stands apart from matter for one reason only. Spirit is free. That's why we Catholics believe spirit and the soul. It's why Pope Leo XIII, my favorite pope, by the way, said the following in his encyclical on liberty. He said, when therefore it is established that man's soul is immortal and endowed with reason and not bound up with things material, the foundation of natural liberty is once most firmly laid. Now, Leo XIII arrives at freedom by showing that men have souls, that they are immortal, that they are not bound up with matter. But when we deal with the new atheist, I think we need to say something else. I think we need to say that the foundation for the existence of the soul and the spirit are firmly laid when we demonstrate that our everyday experience, our interactions, and our language become reduced to meaningless gibberish when we try to deny human freedom. Now, I want to pivot to the other sense of the word freedom I spoke about before, political freedom. When I converted from atheism to Catholicism, the problem of free will was a big part of my conversion. But I didn't just convert from atheism to Catholicism. I also converted from communism to libertarianism. Now, that wasn't a coincidence. Once you really begin to understand and appreciate free will, you want people to have more opportunities to use it. So I'm not knocking anyone in the audience who isn't a libertarian. I'm not here to pitch for libertarianism necessarily. I have some very sharp disagreements with the typical libertarian. But I am a libertarian in the sense that I want people to be as free as they can possibly be while still having a society of laws and rules. I don't think freedom means anarchy. I think we need some kind of structure so that we can use our freedom wisely. So let's recall what Pope Leo said. Every man's soul is endowed with reason. When we use our reason, we don't just act like wild animals and do any crazy thing that comes to mind. We work through our thoughts and intentions, and then we act upon them. At least most of us try to most of the time. Sometimes we fail, but freedom means the freedom to fail. For some time, for instance, I was a blogger. I did all right for a while, but for a whole host of reasons, I had to stop blogging. But while I was doing it, you might say that I was obsessed with one central idea, and it's the idea that Catholicism and libertarianism could coexist, and in fact that they complemented one another. And I didn't even realize it at the time, but it was a complete 180-degree turn. So here I had been a materialist, atheist, and I'd also been a communist. And then I converted to Catholicism and also to libertarianism. So I said before that even though atheism doesn't mean that you have to be a communist, there's a reason why they work well together. And there's a reason why Catholicism and libertarianism work well together too. But let's talk about atheism and communism first. So why do they work so well together? Why were all the great communist leaders such as Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, why were they all committed militant atheists? Why did they want to wipe out religion? Why did they slaughter tens of millions of people? Why did they try to control every aspect of people's lives through a dictatorship? Well, we have to go back to materialism. Remember that I said that materialism is not just the idea that material goods are all that matters. It's the idea that nothing but physical matter exists. Okay? But when we start talking about politics, you see that those two ideas are kind of related. Because if matter is the only thing that exists, there's no spirit, there's no soul, there's no God. Okay? There's certainly no life after this one. So instead we only have this one life to live, and anything that distracts us from getting the most pleasure we can in this life, that's got to be gotten rid of. Anything that stops us from making a better world, anything that stops us from creating the great society, that's got to go. So Christianity's at the top of that list. Why? Because look, Christianity says there is another life after this one. And it also says that the poor and the oppressed in this life will have first place in the next life in heaven. The meek, the poor, these are the ones who are exalted in heaven. The first shall be last, last shall be first. Okay? So in the way the communists see it, that's just a trick that the rich people play on the poor to keep everybody oppressed. You know, just to keep people in their place. They won't challenge the structure if they are expecting a reward in the next life. So obviously that is a threat to people who want to try to build a perfect society in this life, right? So the new atheists are not Marxists, but one of the new atheists, Christopher Hitchens, was a Marxist when he was a young man, just like myself, and I can definitely see the Marxist influence in his writing. So he left Marxism behind, but his atheism grew stronger and more bitter over the years. And when he looks at religion, he sees nothing but a history of bullying and terrorism, and there's just nothing good about it. If you read his book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Okay, and he's not kidding when he says everything. There's nothing in history, nothing in society that he doesn't think is made worse by the presence of religion. Okay, so how does religion poison everything? Well, he has this idea of history where he just focuses on the bad aspects of religion. But there's a whole other history, there's a whole other side of history that he doesn't explore. And I want to explore that here with you tonight. And I have to take you on a little tour through history, and I hope you're still with me. I'll try to not let you get lost along the way, but I think it's really important to understand this because so many atheist attacks on the church, on Christianity, focus on all of these historical atrocities, all these terrible things that the church supposedly did. And so we're going to tie that back into freedom, because I think freedom is the great legacy that Christianity and especially the church gave to the world, and that seems counterintuitive at first. A lot of people don't associate the church with the rise of freedom, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So in the ancient world, the time before Christ, the time we call BC, okay, the idea of freedom was very limited. In most ancient civilizations, the king was worshipped as a god. So in Egypt, they worshipped Pharaoh as a god. In China, they worshipped the emperor as the son of heaven. In Rome, they made gods out of the Caesars. Okay, so that was kind of the standard practice at the time. Now, we know that the Jews didn't have this. The kings of Israel, they had to be accountable to God, a higher power, a supreme being, creator of all things. Now, we Christians also believe that Jesus was God in the flesh. That Jesus said that his kingdom wasn't of this world. So eventually Jesus left this world, whether you believe he died forever or that he ascended into heaven. But he also founded a church, and the church did, and the church exists to this day, exists in the world. So now you have this other institution that also, this God is no longer present among us in the flesh. He's now in heaven. And so the church grows in power and influence, and it becomes a rival to states and governments, to these God kings. And then a great question arises. If the human authorities are not gods, what if those human authorities tell you to do something that is forbidden by God in heaven? So St. Peter answered this question in the Acts of the Apostles. He said, we should obey God rather than men. That's Acts 5:29. It's true that St. Paul also said in Romans 13 that we should obey governments, but only insofar as they do not order us to do something evil. Jesus himself ties these two concepts together, and he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And if Caesar demands something that belongs to God, you don't give it to him. So what the spread of Christianity did was it reordered the moral priorities of man. In the pre-Christian world, the man owed his entire loyalty and obedience to the ruler, to the king on this earth. The world created by Christianity, men had a higher obligation to God. And they fulfilled that obligation through the church that Christ founded. And that's why the early Christians were persecuted. Caesar demanded what was God's, and the Christians wouldn't give it to him. But eventually, as we know, that persecution stopped, and the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. And then all of Europe became Christian. And as you might imagine, the kings and rulers of Europe did not like the competition. You had popes arguing that they had the right to excommunicate kings, that people had a right to overthrow kings that defied the church and went against God's laws. You had great Catholic theologians like St. Robert Bellarmine who argued that the people had a right to change governments when government became oppressive. So, as you can imagine, people who are striving for absolute power, they don't want to hear this, and they don't want their subjects to hear it. Okay? Here's what eventually happened. As time went on, a lot of the kings and a lot of the atheist political philosophers, they got really sick of this situation. They hated the Catholic Church. They said that the church divided men's loyalties, and that's exactly what it did. But they saw that as a bad thing, because they wanted to create societies like the ancient ones I just talked about. Societies in which men worshipped the state as God. Okay? And so they didn't want divided loyalties. They didn't want people to have to choose between following the church, following the king, following God's law, following man's law. And so I hope, in light of that, you'll agree with me that having these divided loyalties was a good thing for liberty. For instance, we wouldn't have the American Revolution without divided loyalty. Now, the American Revolution was not a Catholic revolution. The American founders weren't very big fans of Catholicism. They inherited some of its ideas. So just look at the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson argued for revolution against the British Crown on the idea that God created us with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the purpose of government is to protect those rights. And if the government starts denying those rights, instead of protecting them, then the people have a right and a duty to get rid of that government and install another one. That's the foundation of our entire country. Now, here's the thing. Thomas Jefferson believed that these rights to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, they couldn't exist unless you believed in God. Okay, he asked, can these liberties be thought to be secure if the people stop believing that they come from God? And it was a rhetorical question. The answer is no. Okay, and it's obvious why. Rights are not material things either. Okay, so we talked about spirit before, we talked about souls and how these things are what make us free. Well, the same thing is true of rights. There are no rights in nature. You can't put rights under a microscope. You can't measure rights. Okay, so they're not material things. And yet it makes no sense to talk about political freedom without some reference to rights that place them outside of the context of human authority. Let me explain why. So the kind of rights that America is founded upon, they have three qualities. They're natural. That means they exist before governments exist. Okay? They're individual. That means each one of us has these rights directly given to us by God. And they're inalienable. That's the word Jefferson used, inalienable. And so the government did not create our rights. God did. Governments cannot take away our rights. Governments exist to protect those rights. And when men try to redefine nature and redefine rights, they're setting themselves up to be worshipped as gods. Now, do I think the new atheists want everyone to worship government as a god? No. None of them want that. They want political freedom, just like they want there to be an objective morality. So we can add political freedom to the list of things that the new atheists desire that can't be fulfilled by atheism, right alongside morality. Atheism cannot account for the existence of inalienable rights, but those are the rights that guarantee our freedom, especially the freedom to choose and all the other rights that I think the new atheists would assert in the face of censorship and attempts to silence them. So I'm going to wrap this up. What kind of worldview do you want to have? Do you want to have a worldview in which freedom and morality and individual rights are impossible, or one in which all of those things are real? Do you want to have a worldview in which virtually everything we experience is an illusion and everything we say is gibberish, or do you want one in which our everyday experiences with freedom and language make sense? So atheism is the illusion that life will be better without religion and without God. But it's Christianity that can say with confidence that the things that give meaning to our lives, like freedom and individual liberty, are real things, and they ought to be cherished and defended. Atheism, when it is consistent, says that these things can't exist. And when it is consistent in action as well as in words, it leaves millions of dead in its wake. So that concludes my remarks. Thank you all for your time and attention. Let's start the questions. Okay, we're just going to share the mic here.
A question. Can I hold that mic up to his mouth as well? Put a thing. Can I do that? Sorry. No. Just so you guys know. So this thing right here, my brother is hard of hearing. So this just goes directly to his hearing aid. So if you have a question or you're answering a question, I'm just going to hold it up to your mouth, and it will go directly to his hearing aid so he can hear. So that's all it is. Okay. You can hold your mic.
Thank you very much for the discussion. I also happen to be of the opinion that libertarianism and Catholicism are compatible. That in order to be good, you have to be free. And in order to be free, you have to be good. And a very prominent atheist philosophy within libertarianism, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is objectivism by the philosopher Rand. I'd be interested to know where this philosophy fails.
Where objectivism fails, my goodness. Well, I think it fails for a lot of the same reasons that I talked about tonight. I mean, Rand really hated religion. She hated religion as much as Lenin or Marx ever did. And you know, I feel like where it really fails, I'll tell you, Rand really thought that she was an Aristotelian. She loved Aristotle, but I don't think she really understood Aristotle. You know, I think Aquinas understood Aristotle far better than Rand did. And I sometimes when I was reading Rand, I would think, you know, did she ever read Aquinas? You know, because it was Aquinas who really took Aristotle's thought and perfected it. You know, and I just feel like there's so much that she's missing in her thought. But I would say that just where it fails primarily is just many of the same reasons. She was a materialist as well, although she also believed in free will, probably more than even the Marxists did. Marxists kind of back and forth on free will, but she definitely believed in freedom and the pursuit of one's own personal happiness, but I just don't think she had any foundation for it. Thank you.
Can you talk more about how communism and atheism relate? Because I didn't understand that very well.
So we had a question about how communism and atheism relate together, to expand a little bit more upon that. So I think I can start that by giving you a quote from Marx's mentor. Marx had a mentor named Moses Hess. Moses Hess was a rabbi. And one of his most famous quotes was, so we have rejected the idea that men will ascend into heaven. So what we communists want is to bring heaven down to earth. Okay? I think really the impetus behind it is that if you are focused on another world, if you're looking to heaven, if you're thinking about the afterlife, you're not thinking as much about making this world perfect. And also, I mean, you have a higher moral standard with Christianity. There are certain things you can't do. Now, I know throughout history, Christians have been involved in wars. There have been wars and religious wars and things like that. But we can, in a lot of those cases, we can say that, well, Christians did those things in spite of what their religion taught. Okay, with atheists, there's just really no reason for them to have any kind of higher moral standard. The ends justify the means. That's what Leon Trotsky was a very famous Marxist. And he argued that for Marxists, the ends justify the means if they're going to help bring about communism. So there was really nothing off the table. Nothing was really off limits. So they don't want to be bound to any kind of higher morality. And they don't want people to be looking up to heaven or thinking about hell. This life is it. And so that's got to be the whole focus. So I hope that helps answer the question a little bit.
Please correct me if I'm mistaken. When I was reading the Communist Manifesto a long time ago in college, I could remember there being a part of it that was saying that, you know, Christianity, you know, it's not illegal. You know, these other religions are, you know, tolerated to a degree that they can exist. But then, even though that's in the Communist Manifesto, or the Soviets were very oppressive towards religion, and that just seems like a huge contradiction. And when it was written in stone in the Communist Manifesto, one wouldn't think that they would contradict something that was enough of a core belief to be in the Communist Manifesto, but they did. Could you explain that contradiction?
Well, thank you for that question. It's been some time since I've read the manifesto and what it has to say about religion, but I do recall there was an interview with Karl Marx. From time to time he would be interviewed by journalists, and a journalist asked him what would be done about religion, because Marx was opposed to religion. There might have been times where they would tolerate the idea of religion to help them achieve their ends. You could say the same thing about the Nazis. People like to say Hitler was a Christian. Well, Hitler was willing to use religion. That doesn't mean that he was going to keep it around forever. And I think you might have been able to say the same thing about Marx. The Communist Manifesto was written in, 1848, and he was still kind of a young man. But when they asked him about 30 years later, what are you going to do about religion? What are you going to do about all these people who believe in religion, once the socialist society comes about? And it's interesting, in the interview it says that he paused, and he thought about it, and he said, well, we'll have to use education, So I think his first thought was, well, we're just going to wipe them out, but he didn't want to say that. So he said, well, we'll have to get rid of that through education. And of course the Soviets, as you said, they were very much opposed to religion, and they did suppress it, and they didn't teach it. But I don't think, if any positive references to religion that you'll find in the writings of Marx and Engels, it really is, like for instance, that whole opium of the masses quote, right? Religion is the opium of the masses. Well, they didn't necessarily mean that it made everybody stupid. I mean, Marx was trying to say that life is really hard for the poor, and so they turned to religion to make it better. He wasn't necessarily attacking it with that famous quote, but at the same time, he thought that, he doesn't want people to be hooked on this opium. So he might have been a little sympathetic to people who were religious believers in some respects, but it still had to go.
Was Joseph Stalin a Russian Orthodox seminarian when he was younger?
Yeah.
Yes.
Russian or Greek? Any other questions? Here we go.
I'm kind of a simple guy, but one of the areas of discussion that seems to be all I'm interested in your thoughts about is, for a lot of people who are agnostic or atheists or have difficulty believing are scientific people who believe that, well, you can't prove, like you're talking, it's the science of matter. But to me, I go back to creation. Here's your thoughts. And you read a book like Darwin's Black Box, if you've read that, but it talks about the irreducible complexity of systems. And that the probability that we came into existence without some type of intelligent design is far greater than believing in intelligent design. And is that an argument that is worth using? I'm just curious, because when you think about the probability of a Big Bang and we came from this random thing, it seems to me that intelligent design is much easier to believe from a probability standpoint.
Thank you very much for that question. I agree with you. I mean, I think in the way that the phrase intelligent design is typically used, I totally agree with that. The problem that I think that intelligent design theorists run into is when they make claims about the scientific method that may not hold up. I do think that ultimately it's a philosophical question. It's a logical question. I don't know if the empirical methods of science, at least at this time, can necessarily say definitively, that there is a God. I'm not sure on that. And if somebody is a little bit more knowledgeable about that than me, I would welcome that explanation. But I just know that I feel like the philosophical arguments for God are sufficient, and that you don't really need a scientific demonstration. I am familiar with the book Darwin's Black Box, and I think intelligent design proponents make a lot of great points, but I don't know if I totally agree with their approach. I don't think anybody ever thought of, for instance, Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God as, like the argument from design. I could be wrong about that. Somebody wants to correct me, but I think there's a difference between the two.
What is your conversion story? How did you go from atheism to Catholicism?
Good question.
Well, thank you for asking. I wasn't sure how much of that I wanted to put into the talk, but since you asked, I will start off by saying that when I was an atheist and a communist, I had been to Catholic school, right? K through 12, 13 years of Catholic education. Didn't do a whole lot of wonders for my faith, but one thing always stuck with me, and that was the pro-life argument. When you're in Catholic school, at least at a conservative one like the one I was at, they will show you videos of abortion. They will show you very graphic, bloody videos of abortion, and they expose you to the arguments for pro-life cause. And so even as an atheist, it never sat right with me, the abortion issue. And I was kind of a secret, closeted pro-lifer among my communist comrades. And I kept it secret for some time because I didn't want to make too many waves, and I thought there were higher, more important things to worry about, but I didn't like it. And then one day I came out of the closet on the issue, and the vitriol that was aimed at me for this, I mean, there were a few who were kind of sympathetic to me because they were also secret pro-lifers, but it was like a secret club, Nobody could be openly pro-life. And so once you were, when you just put a giant bullseye on you, you're betraying the revolution, you're betraying women. Women can't be liberated until they can kill their children, and all that sort of thing. The Soviet Union was the first country in history to legalize abortion. Communism really did help bring abortion into the modern world and make it a more widespread practice. So there was that aspect of it. And then, of course, I met a girl who's here with us tonight, my wife of 11 years. And she's the one. Raise your hand. And she's the one who really got me to. I took all my values for granted. One of the reasons I got into Marxism, I really did believe that we had only this one life, that we had to make a better world, and Marxism does provide a very comprehensive worldview on how to go about doing that. And so I was very, very much drawn to that. But I just kind of took that for granted. Like, why do I care so much about this stuff? Why does it matter what the world is like? Why does it matter, I don't know, whether we improve our lives or not? When we're gone, we're gone. So, you really start thinking about, well, why do I value the things that I value? And so, my wife kind of helped me see that, well, yeah, on this basis of this materialist worldview, nothing really matters, and you don't really have any freedom at all. And I'd never really given it that much thought. I was under the impression that Marxists did believe in free will. They did. That's why it was kind of hidden from me, because Marx talked as if he believed in free will, and I didn't really see how his views about matter and materialism made free will impossible, because he wasn't a great philosopher. He was a great social theorist. He was great at studying the economy, but when it came to philosophy, as I now understand, he just wasn't. He didn't cut it. So that contradiction was kind of hidden because he talked so much about free will and humanism and all that kind of stuff. So didn't really make that connection. And a lot of Marxists don't. A lot of Marxists take free will for granted. They really do. And so making that connection really helped. And then I'll say one more thing. Once I got exposed to Catholicism, once I saw how it's viewed in the world, once I understood Catholic theology better and Catholic social teaching better, it was just, you fall in love with it, you fall in love with the whole consistent intellectual framework that just really explains everything and draws everything together. So there's that aspect of it. And we have one more here.
I was wondering, how do you think Catholicism stacks up with other political ideologies outside of libertarianism? I ask because nowadays, and for quite some time now, you've had a duality within the church where you have people who use the Catholic faith as a basis for very liberal views, and you have the opposite side of the coin where they use their faith as the basis for very conservative views. And when I use those terms, I'm using terms that I think are grossly overgeneralized, but I'm using them just to give kind of a framework to my question. So I'm wondering how you think Catholicism stacks up as far as compatibility with other political ideas.
Well, that's a fantastic question.
I'm expecting a fantastic answer. And I believe in him to deliver.
Well, yeah, and it's something that I've studied as well. How does Catholicism mesh with liberalism? How does it go with conservatism? I talked about libertarianism already. Well, here's the thing. I mentioned in my talk that Pope Leo XIII was my favorite pope. And the reason for that is that I think Pope Leo XIII, he was pope at a time when the world was really changing a lot. And new ideas were really all over the place. And you could say that of quite a few popes, but I feel like he grasped those changes the best. And so Pope Leo XIII wrote a lot about the church and politics and things like that. And one of the things that he says is that there are many areas where Christians can disagree, prudential areas. So it is okay. You can be, I mean in the political sense. I don't mean you can you shouldn't really attach those kind of labels to your faith, like liberal or conservative or whatever, but when it comes to your politics, yes, you can have a leaning to the left, you can have a leaning to the right, as long as you are within certain boundaries, So there's a lot of room for variation within Catholic political thought. Now, most Catholics in the U.S., from the polling that I've seen, are conservatives, they're Republicans, and that's easy to see why, because the GOP is supposedly the pro-life party, at least in name. And often in practice. I was happy when Trump nominated Gorsuch for the Supreme Court. We might finally get to that Supreme Court majority, right, where we maybe can overturn Roe versus Wade. So I can understand why there's a pro-conservative, pro-Republican bias among American Catholics. And I'm not a huge fan of liberalism. I'm not a huge fan of leftism. But I do respect, I think you need both. I think having both voices in the church is a good thing. I think, even the liberals that I disagree with, I like hearing what they have to say because sometimes we can all go a little too far, and you need an opposite force to kind of pull you back. So I really think there's a place in the church for liberals, for conservatives, for libertarians, and I don't say that anybody has to be a libertarian as a Catholic. I just think that you can be one. I think it's consistent, and I think you can be a certain kind of liberal, a certain kind of conservative, and still be a good Catholic. So I hope that answers the question somewhat.
It does.
Hey, and any other? Oh, we got to wrap it up. Do we have time for one more?
One more.
Okay, one more.
Thank you. So you said at the beginning of your talk that you devoted some time to defending libertarianism from a Catholic standpoint. Immediately just by the language there, that implies that, at least for a lot of people, that Catholic social teaching and libertarianism, certain areas where they can bristle. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, what are some of the things that you find are most difficult to reconcile between the two, and how do you do it?
Thank you very much for that question. Okay, so the most difficult things about reconciling libertarianism and Catholicism. Well, look, libertarians really do, the highest value for them is liberty, is personal freedom. Now, it's pretty high on the list for me too, but I don't think that it's necessarily the highest value as a Catholic. And when you try to elevate liberty above all other things, that's where the conflict is going to come from. There are, of course, there's many types of libertarian, there's many types of communists, so it's hard to just narrow down one libertarianism. But I would say that libertarianism runs into its biggest problems, as any other ideology does, when it sets some other value higher than God's will and God's law. So I'd say that as a Catholic libertarian, you always have to keep your values, your hierarchy of values in perspective. You always have to make sure that you're not making liberty into your God. You can value it very highly, you can value it above many other things, but it should not be valued above God. One of the saddest things to me, one of the greatest libertarians of the 20th century, named Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard is kind of the father of American libertarianism. Now, he was Jewish by birth and atheist by choice. And yet, at the same time, he really appreciated the Catholic tradition. Now, he was one of the ones who convinced me, more than anybody, that libertarianism grew out of the Catholic tradition. And yet, he just couldn't bring himself to embrace it because he still valued personal autonomy so much, to the point that, not only did he support abortion, but he supported the idea of parents selling their children on the market. He went so nuts with his libertarian views that he really lost sight, I think, of some important aspects of human dignity that you only get with the church. So, to me, that was always the most difficult thing. It's like, where do you put the limit? And I'd say for me as a Catholic libertarian, it's a very broad limit. I want freedom, but it's got to be bound by the Catholic understanding of human dignity and human person. So, that's what I'd say about that.
Say that probably the chief argument that would sum up everything he said was just illustrated what this woman here did for her brother, the greatest act of charity. I don't know if you were moved, but I was incredibly moved. Complete selflessness. If you don't have a husband, gentlemen, this is the kind of woman